The morning Sandra Holden's landscaping crew arrived at the rear boundary of my property with a commercial chipper and 3 workers carrying long-reach hedge trimmers. I was 2 states away at a structural engineering conference in Atlanta, presenting a paper on load-bearing wall failure analysis, and my property camera system sent me the alert at 9:47 while I was standing at the podium finishing my 3rd slide, and I looked at my phone under the lectern for 4 seconds. Confirmed what I was seeing, finished my presentation without deviation because the presentation had been scheduled for 8 months, and the camera was recording, and the evidence was accumulating correctly whether I was present or not. And then I stepped off the stage and called my attorney from the conference hallway before I called my wife. My name is Thomas Aldridge. I am 54 years old, a licensed structural engineer and registered architect with 26 years of experience in load-bearing systems, residential and commercial construction, and material failure analysis, and I have lived in the Ridgecrest Commons HOA development in central North Carolina for 8 years. My wife Sandra, who shares a name with the person who ordered my hedgerow destroyed, and who found this fact grimly amusing when I told her, teaches organic chemistry at the university 15 miles from our house. Our property is a 4-bedroom contemporary on a corner lot at the eastern end of the development, with a substantial rear garden that Sandra Aldridge had been building for 6 of the 8 years we had lived there, and that was the context in which the Hedges existed. The Hedges was Sandra Aldridge's project, and I want to be precise about this because the story only makes sense if you understand what they meant to her. She had grown up in rural Mississippi on a farm where her grandmother kept a kitchen garden that had been the center of the household's relationship with the land, and she had spent 30 years in academic chemistry looking at molecular structures, and she had come to gardening late, and with the specific intensity of someone who had been waiting for it. The hedgerow she had planted along the northern boundary of our rear garden was not merely a privacy screen. It was the edge condition that defined the interior space where she grew the medicinal and culinary plants that had become her secondary scholarly interest and that she had been publishing research on for 4 years. The hedges created the light quality, the wind protection, and the visual closure that made the garden function the way she needed it to function. 7 years of growth. Japanese holly, not Leyland cypress, which she had chosen specifically for the leaf density and the evergreen character, and the way the small dark leaves responded to the specific quality of afternoon light in central North Carolina. 14 feet of dense growth along 108 linear feet of northern boundary, shaped annually to a precise profile she had developed over the first 3 years of growth. Sandra Holden was the HOA board president. She had been president for 16 months. She lived in the lot directly north of ours, on the other side of the hedgerow, and she had filed her first complaint about the hedge height in her 4th month of residence and her 6th month as a board member. She had filed 4 complaints total over 14 months. All 4 had been dismissed by the full board, which had a 6-member composition, and among whom Sandra Holden's 3 allies were consistently insufficient to form a majority on the hedge question. What Sandra Holden had not been able to accomplish through the board vote process, she had apparently decided to accomplish through unilateral action, which was the specific type of miscalculation that produces the specific type of legal outcome I am going to describe. I learned the full story of how she had authorized the destruction from the HOA's property manager, a woman named Dana Pratt at Greenway Property Services, who called me the afternoon of the destruction with the specific tone of a professional who had just discovered that someone acting under apparent HOA authority had done something that was going to create significant liability for the association, and who wanted the affected party to understand that the management company had not authorized it. Dana said Sandra Holden had called the landscaping company Cascade Garden Services and had authorized the work using her title as board president. She had not obtained a board vote. She had not notified the management company. She had authorized a commercial landscaping crew to enter the property of a homeowner whose hedge had been the subject of 4 dismissed complaints, while an HOA board member without the authority to do so. Dana said, "I want to be clear that this was not authorized by the board, and was not authorized by Greenway. When I learned what had happened this morning, I called the remaining board members, and they are uniformly upset. I said, I appreciate you calling, Dana. Please document everything you have just told me and send it to my attorney. His name is James Waller. She sent it within the hour. James had already been called. When I called him from the conference hallway, he had been my agricultural and property attorney for 12 years, and he had heard enough situations to assess one quickly. He said, she acted unilaterally without board authorization. I said, that is what the property manager just told me. He said, that is the central fact. She used her board title to authorize work that the board had refused to authorize through 4 votes. That is not board action. That is individual misconduct under color of board authority. I said, what does that mean for liability? He said it means Sandra Holden is personally liable for the full scope of damages independent of any HOA liability. She did not have authorization. She is the principal. She will also likely face a board censure or removal proceeding from the other board members based on what you have described. I said, what are my immediate steps? He said, I need a full engineering assessment of the damage, same as I have asked for in prior situations. I need the camera footage archived to multiple locations. I need Sandra Aldridge's documentation of the hedge history. And I need you to not contact Sandra Holden or anyone at the landscaping company until I have reviewed everything. I said, understood. I flew home that evening. Sandra Aldridge met me at the door. She had been at the property all day. She had taken 400 photographs of the destruction. She had a 30-page document on her laptop that she had been building since noon that described the hedge history with citations to her research publications, where the hedge was referenced as part of her experimental garden design, the growth record she had maintained since the first planting. The annual shaping records, the light measurements she had taken at various points in the garden that documented the hedge's role in creating the specific conditions she required for her research. She handed me the document when I walked in the door. She said, I compiled everything James will need. I said, you compiled it while it was happening. She said, I wanted it current. I started the document at 11 this morning when I was still outside watching the crew work and could not stop them. I said, you documented while you watched. She said, what else would I do? I looked at her, she looked at me. She had been building that garden for 6 years, and she had watched it be destroyed that morning, and her response had been to compile documentation because she was Sandra Aldridge, and that was what she did when confronted with a situation that required a response. I said, I am sorry. She said, the garden is not gone, the hedges are gone, the garden is changed but not gone. We will decide what replaces the hedges. I said, what do you want there? She said, something that cannot be cut, something that does not depend on another person's restraint, something that will be there regardless of who moves in next door and regardless of what they believe about my right to have a boundary condition on my own property. I said, tell me what you want. She said, I want you to build me a wall that is an experiment. I looked at her, she said, I have been studying how plants interact with constructed surfaces for 2 years, vertical gardens on masonry, substrate selection for biofilm development. The wall should have a planted face that is part of the experiment, built into it from the beginning, not decorative, scientific. I said, tell me the specifications. She said, interior facing, smooth concrete surface suitable for substrate application. The substrate is a specially prepared growing medium I can apply to the concrete face that will support the specific plant communities I want to study. The plants establish in the substrate on the wall face the way they establish on natural rock faces in the environments I study. I said, a living wall as a scientific installation. She said, a living wall that is also a property boundary, that is also a peer-reviewed experiment that I will be publishing about. I said, the published record will make it permanent in a different way than the concrete. She said, yes. I want Patricia Holden's action to produce a scientific paper about the wall she forced me to build. I looked at Sandra Aldridge and thought about how long I had been married to her and how she was still surprising me and said, "I will build you the best concrete wall in Ridgecrest Commons." She said, "Build me the most scientifically interesting one." I said, "I can do both." The design took 2 weeks. Sandra Aldridge specified the interior face requirements and I designed around them. The structural requirements were my standard specification: concrete block cores with rebar reinforcement, 36-inch footing, 10-foot height with the county permit. The interior face was the element that made this wall different from every other wall in this collection. Sandra Aldridge's research involved plant communities that colonize exposed rock surfaces in specific ecological conditions. The substrate she worked with was a proprietary growing medium she had been developing for 3 years, a mixture of organic material, mineral components, and selected microbial communities that she applied to masonry surfaces to create conditions suitable for the specific plants she studied. The substrate could be applied to a prepared concrete face and would support plant establishment within 1 growing season under the right conditions. The interior face of the wall, facing Sandra's garden, needed to be smooth concrete without stucco or finish coating, because the substrate required direct contact with the masonry surface. I specified the block course on the interior face to be finished with a thin-set mortar skim that produced a smooth surface with the porosity characteristics Sandra needed. I also specified drainage channels at the base of the interior face and a drip irrigation system integrated into the wall cap that would deliver precise moisture to the substrate according to the schedule Sandra's research required. The drip irrigation was the element I found most technically interesting. I designed it as a perforated manifold set into the top course of the block, just below the wall cap, fed by a small reservoir tank mounted inside the garden on the wall, and controlled by a timer programmed to Sandra's experimental protocol. The system delivered moisture at a rate measurable enough to be documented as an experimental variable. Sandra Aldridge reviewed the design drawings for 3 days. She made 6 requests for modifications, all related to the substrate interface specifications, all of which I incorporated. The final design was something I had not designed before and would not have designed without her: the intersection of structural engineering and plant ecology expressed as a property boundary. I pulled the permit the week after the destruction. 10-foot wall, standard residential application. The building department inspector who reviewed the drawings asked about the drip irrigation system in the wall cap. I explained it. He said he had been reviewing residential construction plans for 15 years, and this was the first permit application he had processed for a wall with an integrated experimental irrigation system. He approved it without modification. James's civil claim was proceeding in parallel. The assessment I prepared for the hedge valuation covered 4 components on the same model I had described in the Briggs and Aldgate accounts: the hedge replacement cost, the installation labor, the growth time value using the horticultural valuation methodology, and the research impact value, which was the component I had not seen in any prior assessment I was aware of. The research impact value covered the economic cost to Sandra Aldridge's research program of the hedge's destruction. The hedge had been documented in 2 of her published papers as a component of her experimental garden design. Its destruction before the completion of the research program it supported had created a research disruption that I calculated by reference to the grant funding attached to that research, the remaining experimental timeline, and the cost of re-establishing comparable conditions. The research impact value was $22,000 of the total $48,000 assessment. James sent the assessment to Sandra Holden's attorney, a man named Philip Cross, with the civil claim. Philip called James within 3 days. He said, "The research impact value." James said, "Dr. Sandra Aldridge is a published researcher. Her hedge was documented in peer-reviewed publications as a component of her experimental design. Its unauthorized destruction has disrupted an ongoing research program with attached grant funding." Philip said, "An HOA hedge complaint produced a research impact damages claim. James said, an HOA board president acting without board authorization destroyed a property feature that was part of a scientist's documented research installation. The research impact is a foreseeable consequence of the destruction. Philip said, I need to discuss this with my client. He called back 2 days later. He said, my client wants to resolve this quickly. James said, the demand is $48,000 in property damages, $22,000 in research impact damages, my fees from the full litigation period, and a formal written acknowledgement from Sandra Holden, personally, that she acted without board authorization. Philip said, the personal acknowledgement. James said, she used her board title to authorize work the board had refused to authorize 4 times. The acknowledgement is not optional. My client wants it on record that this was Sandra Holden's individual action, not the board's. Philip said, the board has already issued a censure. James said, I know. The personal acknowledgement is separate from the censure and is a condition of settlement. The personal acknowledgement was the element Philip took longest to secure. Sandra Holden apparently resisted it because it was the most direct admission of personal liability. Philip spent a week working on her before she agreed to sign it. The signed acknowledgement arrived with the settlement agreement. It stated that Sandra Holden, acting in her individual capacity and not under board authorization, had directed Cascade Garden Services to perform hedge removal work on the property of Thomas and Sandra Aldridge without the board's knowledge or consent, and that the action was hers alone. The settlement total was $83,000. Sandra Holden's homeowner's insurance covered $41,000. Sandra Holden paid $42,000 personally. Her personal payment was the highest personal component of any settlement in this collection, and it reflected the combination of the research impact damages and the personal liability that attached when board authorization was absent. The board voted 5-0 to censure Sandra Holden at their emergency session. She resigned from the board 2 weeks after the settlement. She listed her property for sale the month after the resignation. The property sold in 30 days to a family named the Washingtons, whose oldest daughter was 12 and whose mother, a woman named Dr. Patricia Washington, was a soil ecologist who came to introduce themselves the first weekend they were in the house, and spent 45 minutes in Sandra Aldridge's garden looking at the substrate application on the wall face and asking questions that revealed she understood exactly what she was looking at. Dr. Patricia Washington and Sandra Aldridge have had dinner twice since the Washingtons moved in. I have not been invited to these dinners. Sandra tells me they discuss substrate microbiome communities, and I believe her. I also believe I would not have contributed meaningfully to either conversation. The wall construction happened after the settlement was finalized. 5 days of work. Robert Gaines handled the finish coursework. The drip irrigation manifold went in on day 4. The wall cap went on day 5. I checked the irrigation system timing on day 5, and it was running at the specifications Sandra had provided. Sandra Aldridge applied the substrate to the interior face the following weekend. She worked for 12 hours spread across 2 days, applying the material in sections, documenting each section's composition in the field notebook she used for all her research observations. When she finished, the wall face had a thin uniform coating that looked to my eye like the surface of a stone outcrop in early spring, slightly textured, slightly varied in color, carrying the particular quality of a surface that is about to become something. She took her first set of research photographs that evening in the last available light. She said, documentation initiated. I said, the wall is documented in the permit file and in my construction record. She said, my documentation is different from yours. I said, yes. She said, mine will be in a journal. I said, when? She said, 18 months, if the establishment rate is what I expect. 2 years to have data worth writing about. The paper will cite the wall's construction date and the circumstances of the research installation's creation. I said the paper will cite Sandra Holden's action as the proximate cause of the research installation. She said the paper will note that the installation was created as a replacement for a destroyed hedge row. The reasons for the destruction will be in the acknowledgements section, where I thank the attorneys who made the installation possible. I said James Waller in the acknowledgements of a plant ecology paper. She said he earned it. She went inside. I stood at the wall in the North Carolina evening, looking at the substrate-coated interior face that would spend the winter developing the microbial community that Sandra's research required, and would by spring begin showing the plant establishment that was the experiment's first observable phase. The wall was 10 feet of concrete block, with rebar-reinforced cores and a 36-inch footing, and a drip irrigation manifold in the cap, and a research substrate on the interior face that no landscaping crew would ever cut down because concrete does not cut. It was exactly what Sandra Aldridge had asked me to build. It was more than she had asked for in the ways that structural engineering adds to things when it is applied correctly: the footing specification and the irrigation system integration and the drainage channels, things she had not specified because she did not need to, because that was my part, and I had done my part correctly. It would be there for 30 years. The research would be published in 18 months. James Waller would be in the acknowledgements. The substrate would develop the microbial community, and the plants would establish, and the data would accumulate, and Sandra Aldridge would write a paper about a wall built on a corner lot in central North Carolina that was both a property boundary and a scientific experiment. Sandra Holden had cut down a hedge. What grew in its place was a peer-reviewed experiment. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was, as Sandra Aldridge would say if you asked her, exactly what the data required. Thumbnail text: she had a chemist's 7-year research hedge destroyed without board authorization. The chemist built a wall that became a scientific paper.